time to make our oven mitt, the double oven mitt. And what we're going to start with is the fabric that we had left over from the crisscross apron, its coordinate, and we do include an extra strip of fabric in your kit to make sure that we have enough for the oven mitt and the hand pocket portion, because there's very little left after you have cut out the crisscross apron from that coordinate that's included in our kit. Then we also include a fat quarter of a third fabric that's going to be used for the binding. And so you'll end up with one fabric for the back and the front, matching pockets, and there's fabric on the inside of the pocket as well. And then the binding that goes around the pockets and the entire outside of your double oven mitt. And also inside is the heat reflective fleece and a layer of batting. So let's cut this out. In your pattern, it goes through the process here, and it outlines which way to cut your fabric. If you started with the apron kit that also included the oven mitt, follow the instructions that are on the left-hand side of the first page. If you just purchased the pattern or the double oven mitt kit itself, follow the cutting instructions on the right side of the first page. Now, of course, the yardage is the same and the size is the same. It just depends on where you started, okay? So let's get going to cut. The one thing I want to mention before we cut anything out is you need to determine the width of your double oven mitt. I've shown you a couple of times my samples, and they are two different widths. They're both approximately 8 inches across this way, but I made them different sizes for the different size casserole dishes or baking pans that I take in and out of my oven. And I just found this one to be easier for smaller casserole dishes. And this one measures about 24 inches wide. The other one is about 32 inches wide, and it works really, really well with my roaster for Thanksgiving, like a turkey roaster. What I really recommend that you do before starting, or before just determining that the measurements that I put in the pattern are what work for you, is to look at what you use at home. And what I did to measure is I took my hands and the roaster, and I measured from where I would hold it all the way across the front of the roaster and down the side again where I hold it on my right hand. So that became the measurement of what I wanted my double oven mitt to be. And I added 2 inches onto that. And so we're first going to cut our fabric to match this large one, which is 34 inches by 8. I'm going to set aside the binding fabric for now, because that is actually going to be a little tutorial on itself, is how to get 2-inch bias binding out of a fat quarter. So first, what I'm going to do is I've already determined that I would like to have the front and the back of the oven mitt the same. And then I'm going to use the coordinate of my apron to be the pockets themselves, and that's going to be the coordinate. So I'll set that aside and we'll cut that out in a second. But our oven mitt is going to measure 8 inches by 34 is what I want to cut out. So I'm using my cutting mat here to do that. So I'm going to cut 2 strips that are 8 inches wide. Of course, if I could do math, I'd figure out the right ones. And then set the rest aside. And now I'm going to cut them to 24. Or 34. So I'm going to make the larger one. Okay. And we'll set those aside. So again, this fabric came from the leftover fabric from the apron pattern. The coordinate, we're going to cut 4 pieces that measure 6.5 by 8. Those are going to be the 2 hand pockets. Let me move this up. I have to do some straightening. Oops. And we'll set that aside for later. And now we need 4 pieces that are 6.5 inches wide. Oops, what am I doing here? Okay, so those are the 4 pockets. Now, from the fusible fleece, the heat-resistant fleece, we want 1 strip that measures 8 inches. I'm going to fold that twice. By 34. And if you'd like to use the remaining strip of fleece in the actual pockets, you can do that too. You wouldn't need to just put the batting in there unless you have another project for that. But I think it's a perfect size actually for a couple of trivets. And you know, if you have any left over here, you can make a couple of trivets with it as well. Now, we also need 8 by 34 out of the batting as well. I think I have to cut 1 inch off of that. Yep. And 2 for the pockets. And if these aren't exact, that's okay, because they go inside. 6.5. By 8. I'm going to cut this one. Okay, so now we have the front, the back, the heat resistant fleece and batting. And I'm actually going to go ahead right now and layer these up. We'll need that in the next step. So that becomes your layer. And our pockets as well will have the batting, and you can select which side of the fabric you'd like to be on the outside and inside. But both sides are pretty identical. I don't think you can make a bad decision either way. Okay, so now we have that, and I'm going to set this batting aside too because we're done with that. Our next step, and I'm going to refer back to the actual double oven mitt, is they have rounded corners, each curve here. So we want to cut off our little points and make a curve. And the easiest way to do that is find a water glass or a mug or a coffee, or like a soup can or anything that has a curve to the size that you want. There's no right or wrong size to the curve. I just take into account that we are going to be sewing bias binding around the curve. So I didn't want it to be too tight, and I didn't want it to be too oval. So I actually used a mug. Isn't that cute? That we're going to use to make that curve. Okay, so I found a pen, and it can be a fabric pen and it can be just a regular ink pen because you're not going to ever see the marking. You're going to cover it up, you're going to sew on top of it, and no issue with just a regular pen. So take your round curve, take your pen, and just mark along the curve on two sides of each pocket and on the sides of each of the main oven mitt. And I actually just use a scissor to do this because I think it's a little bit more accurate than trying to cut through the layers with your rotary cutter. So follow the curve that you drew. Actually, you can stack these up as well whatever makes it easiest for you to do the nice curves. If you're good at just eyeballing, that works too. Now with this one, what I'm going to do is use some clips. You can use clips or pins, but with the number of layers that we have here, it's perfect to use these really, really great clips. It's good to have them around, let me tell you. So follow the line that you drew to create your curve. Okay. So now we have the two pockets and the wider oven mitt. The next thing that we're going to do, there's two different steps. One, we're going to quilt the main oven mitt. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do is grab a fabric pencil and we're going to mark the center of this long piece. That's going to be where we start stitching across. And I just do straight stitches across the front of the oven mitt. You can quilt it any way that you would like. So if you want to do some decorative stitching or anything like that, please feel free to do that. I just like the simple, you know, straight stitching going across the front of the oven mitt itself. And I just find that if I find my center and mark it with my fabric pencil, that's where I start. And it's also where I change out my foot on my sewing machine to be a walking foot. It just makes it so much easier to go through the layers that you're working with to make this oven mitt. On the pockets themselves, what we're going to do is we're going to baste around the outside, because these aren't quilted. You can if you want, I didn't, but just to baste around the outside with a long basting stitch, just to keep everything intact. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put the bias binding on the edge to secure the edge of this. And we're going to take a moment to take you through the process of making bias binding as well. And once you're back, we will attach that to the pockets for our double oven mitt. Hi, we have in front of us a fat quarter, and what I'm going to do is convert this fat quarter into a long 2-inch bias strip to be used for any binding project that you might have. This one I'm actually going to be using on our double oven mitt, but you can use it for any time you have a square, a rectangle, a fat quarter, or what you believe is kind of too small for binding, but it really isn't. And let me show you what I do to convert this fat quarter into binding, okay? First, what I do, it's got to be on a bias. So we need to be cutting strips that are at a 45-degree angle. In order to do that, we need to make this piece of fabric just a little bigger, okay? So I take one corner of the fat quarter and I had it sitting so that the 22 inches is in front of me here and the 18 is this. So what I'm trying to do is get really, really long strips, okay? So if I fold this up, and I'm just going to finger press it, but you can move it to your ironing board and actually press a crease into it if you'd like. But with the black that I'm using right now, I can see a finger pressed fold pretty well, okay? And what I'm going to do is then open it up. Now I can see it, and I'm just going to cut across that fold line. And move that up just a little bit. Keep it straight. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is, if you can think about this being A and B and B, what I'm going to do is make sure that my A's always match. So I'm just going to take this piece that I've cut, almost cut, and I think I need a new rotary blade, and lay it over on this edge. Right sides together. And I'm going to jump over here and I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from the edge. I've stitched my 1/4 inch, and now what we need to do is iron open or press open the seam. Okay. I'm going to set this aside. So now we have a lot of fabric that we can cut our 2-inch bias strips from. There are many ways to actually sew continuous bias by marking every 2 inches, and then you join these 2 pieces to create a tube from which you cut all of your bias, and then you have one continuous piece. I actually seem to take too much time to make everything match on my lines, so I just end up cutting my bias strips here, and then I sew them together on the sewing machine really quick. So I'm just going to take a minute here and cut all of my strips. I really do need a new blade. And you're just cutting right through the seam that you just sewed. Now, I won't need this much binding when I do the project I'm currently working on, which is the oven mitt, but it's good to just make all of the binding for future projects. You never know when you're going to need additional binding or solid black. I actually use that a lot. Sometimes the last one isn't 2 inches exactly, but this one is pretty close. There we go. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take and match right sides to right sides. Pin it in place or use a clip and sew them on your sewing machine. And I just go right on down the line here and continue to clip each one of these and take the whole bunch over to the sewing machine at the same time and just sew them all up. And then we'll come back and we'll press the seams open. Be right back. Okay, we've sewn all of the pieces together, the strips I should say, and what I just finished doing was ironing all the seams open. And now what I'm doing is taking and my rotary cutter, and I guess you can't really see it from behind the ironing board, but I'm removing any of the little wings that are created when you sew on a diagonal, because we don't really need that excess fabric inside the bias binding. So once I'm done with that, we can sew up or iron and press our binding. There are a lot of tools, little gadgets out there that you can use to speed up this process. I actually just use my iron and ironing board and press the bias in half. Give it a good press. Keep sliding it across. Until you have the whole entire thing pressed in half. That is my marker. And then what I do is I come back and I will pull in each one of the sides so that each edge of the 2-inch binding touches at the fold in the center, and then I press. And this step is what the tools that are available on the market are great for, because you don't have to get so close. Your fingers don't have to get so close to the iron. Mine don't anyway. So I just simply go across and match my selvages into the fold and continue on. The next step, after you do the whole long piece, is to fold it in half on itself. And that's where you have your binding that looks like the binding that you get when you buy pre-packaged from a store. Okay? Continue doing this until you have the entire binding pressed and ready to go. We'll be right back. Well, I finished ironing and I just measured, and out of a fat quarter of fabric, and this is our solid black tuxedo, I was able to make 5.5 yards of bias binding. So this is going to last a little bit, and it'll be more than enough for the project that I'm currently working on, which is our double oven mitt. So that is the process of turning a fat quarter into bias binding. And I hope you just do that for your next project where you don't need to go to the store and buy any store-bought binding. Enjoy! I've switched out the foot to be a walking foot because now we're going to quilt the top of our, we can call it a quilt sandwich here, even though it's an oven mitt. And I've marked a white line with our fabric pencil, and we're going to just start. And again, we don't need to back tack or anything like that. I'm just starting and I'm going to sew across. Once we get to the end, I just simply sew right off the top. And as you can see, the layers don't stay perfectly even because you're pushing so much fabric through the walking foot. And I clip the thread before I start going back the other direction. And I actually do use the guide for the walking foot now and again, but I have gotten used to seeing what an inch happens to be, and I just kind of do about an inch apart. So I'll start always on the left side of my last stitch line and just continue to go straight, stitching straight across the top of the oven mitt. Now I'm going to step away and just complete the whole entire top, and we'll come back and continue assembling our double oven mitt. See you in a moment. We're back, and I have two pockets, hand pockets, that are basted on the outside edge. We have our main portion of the oven mitt all quilted, and it looks kind of interesting simply because the batting moves, everything kind of shifts when you're sewing straight lines across 4 different fabrics. So what we're going to do now is we're going to set this aside for one moment, and we're going to put the facing along, the bias binding facing along each one of the straight edges of the pockets. So let's just measure, and this is our bias binding, and we're just going to measure and cut so that we have 2 pieces, and we'll come back and use this when we finish the entire oven mitt. What I do now though is there's 2 ways to do this. Typically when you add binding to a project, we're either sewing it to the front or sewing it to the back, and we're flipping it around the other side, and then we're top stitching. With such a small piece and a straight piece that it is, what I recommend doing is just opening up your binding and position the edge of your pocket right along that center fold, and then pull the top of the binding over the top edge and clip it. And then you can go to your sewing machine and top stitch right along that fold right there, and that'll secure both sides of the binding. So let's open this up, lay that right in the center, and pull that just around. You're going to manipulate it a little bit once you get to the sewing machine anyway, just to make sure that it's in place before you start sewing. Because the middle always looks like it's going to move on you until you sit down and sew. So we have these clipped, and now we'll go attach them. Here's our hand pocket, and we are going to situate this. I'm going to take off that first clip. Make sure that it's securely around the top edge of the facing, and we're going to stitch right along this folded edge of the bias binding there. And stitch as close as you feel comfortable, and you just adjust as you go. Let's do the next one. And also a good thing to remember is don't pull the top too far around, because we want to make sure we secure the bottom as well. You can always tell when you get to the edge whether or not the bottom is lower than the top. And there we go. Now we're ready to add it to our oven mitt. Guess what? We are almost done making our double oven mitt. So now what we have our pockets that have the binding across the top, and we also have the oven mitt that's been quilted. And I took a moment to trim it. You're going to see a little bit of unevenness because of the quilting. And also, when you position your pockets on each edge, you're going to need to adjust them just a little bit, because the pockets themselves are not quilted. And so they're not going to have shrunk in. They're a little larger than what the quilted oven mitt is. So just adjust those to feel comfortable that they have the same curve and that they can be sewn together around the edges. That's the most important thing. So you will have to do a little bit of trimming. If it doesn't look right to you, just clean up the edges and get it ready to put the binding on. Okay, so this one I did have to adjust just a little bit on this edge as well as this one. Okay, now what I want to make sure that you do is always remember, before you put the binding on and before you put your pockets on, which side you put the heat resistant fleece to, because that's the side that we want to always be in the direction of your oven. That's what protects your hands. So make sure that you're putting the pockets on the other side. So the side that has the heat resistant fleece on it needs to be facing down on your table right now. Position your pocket, and again, grab your clips. And connect those. Kind of clip them together. So I'm going to flip that over. And then we're going to baste around the edges to secure the pocket to the oven mitt itself before we add the bias to it. Now this one needs to be trimmed. I'm going to flip this over because the pocket is wider than the oven mitt, and that's not going to make for a very nice binding. So I'm going to trim that up so that it matches it. There we go. Perfect. And then I'll clip that. And I'll baste these in place, and I'll be right back. Now we have the hot hand pockets basted on, and it's time to do the final step, which is the binding. And the best way to do this is to start on the back, which is the side with the heat resistance facing up, and then we're going to stitch on the binding all the way around, and we will flip it to the front and then finish it on the top. And let's start. Find the end of our binding. And I actually just start about, I would say about 4 inches in from the end of the binding. And that gives me a little bit of a tail so that when I have sewn the binding all the way around, I can actually stitch to close the opening and before we turn it to the other side. And so I like about 4 inches here, and you can have more or less, whatever you're most comfortable with, but that's what I start with. And I see that I have a seam right where I want to start. So I'm going to go a little bit further, and I'm going to open up the edge, open up the fold, open it up again so that the flat edge of the binding is along the edge of your double oven mitt. And clip. Because what we're going to do is we're going to use the fold line, the very, very first fold line, as your stitch line. So I'm just going to start by clipping along the way till I get down to the curve. And once I get to the curve, I'm going to move it just a little bit, and then I'm going to clip. That's when I stop clipping. It's time to sew. Because then I can manipulate the binding, and that's the reason why it is a bias binding and not a straight binding. We want it to curve. We want it to stretch a little bit around the curve, and it's perfect to do this because you go slow, you stitch really, really slow, and you can move it as you go around the curve while you stitch, okay? So I'm going to clip one more here, and then I'll show you what it looks like as I'm sewing on the sewing machine. Okay. We're at the sewing machine and attaching the binding to what I would consider the back side of the double oven mitt. And I have a little bit of a tail here because I don't want this, if you can see this, I don't want this seam to be right at the point where I join this. So I'm going to go a little bit further, and then we're going to start sewing. And this fold line is right here. And that's where I'm going to sew, because once we're done sewing, we can take this entire binding and fold it around to the front. And this is when it's important to backstitch as well. So we want to tack this down as we go. Okay. Take you around the curve here so you can see how to adjust the fabric just a little bit. Okay. So just a little bit further. And if you feel more comfortable with pins at this moment, that's fine too. And just use a lot of them to angle. I'm going to pull this forward here to angle it as you go. Okay, lift it up, slide your fabric, and turn this just a little bit, and just go slow. And now I'm going to move this clip and just keep it along the edge and turning as you go. I think I have a squeak. Lift and turn. And then I'm going to clip further down to keep the binding kind of away from the sewing machine. It over on the edge. Oh. There we go. And make sure everything's lined up. It is. And we'll keep going. I will meet you guys on the other side. As you can see, I have sewn all the way around the perimeter of the oven mitt. And now I have this opening that I have to actually close up so that we can top stitch around the front of the oven mitt to finish this off. And so if you're a quilter, you have your techniques for finishing off your binding. Different tools are available to guide you as to how far you should be apart and how to stitch these together. When it comes to something like this oven mitt, I actually simply take the two ends and pull them together until they're touching and actually almost gathering or pulling just a tad bit. And then I line up the folded edge here because that's the only thing anybody's going to see. And I pin right at that intersection. And I'm going to cut off a little bit of this right now, just so that it's kind of out of my way. And we'll get rid of that. And then I just, starting at the fold, I'll pull this apart a little bit. I probably didn't give myself enough space here, but I'm going to pull that apart, and then I'm going to stitch along this pin line to seal it. And then we're going to finger press it open and pull everything around to the front and finish. Okay, and then we need to finish that off so that it's no longer open. Now we're pulling the binding from the back that we've stitched on to the front, and we're going to clip it all the way around and top stitch. And it's great how the curve just fits in there so nicely. And if you're sewing ended up taking too much fabric, then feel free to trim your curve so that it's not too bulky for top stitching. Work it around. Get some more of my clips. There we go. This is going to make such a pretty oven mitt. The black with the red is absolutely gorgeous. Okay, I am going to go and stitch this on and be right back. We just finished top stitching all the way around the outside of the bias binding, and it really was fun to the curves, and that's why the bias binding is so great, is to just stitch really quickly around the curves and clip the last thread and say that you accomplished. And it was great to do this oven mitt, a double oven mitt. And I don't know if I can get it any closer so that you can see how everything ended up. And this is going to be a really, really fun gift for somebody that I have in mind. So this one is 34 inches and the shorter one is 24 for a smaller casserole dish. And then the one that I also have on our website is 34 inches. So they're really, really a lot of fun. And I hope you enjoy making yours, and send us any questions that you would like at services@SewBatik.com. And if you haven't purchased anything like this yet, you can shop our website at www.SewBatik.com and look for the Double Oven Mitt kit. Also look for the crisscross apron pattern or the kit, and also comes with an option to get the little bit of additional fabric and the heat resistant fleece to make a matching oven mitt. So enjoy, and we'll see you later.